This area represents New Bedford, Massachusetts in the late 1950s. New Bedford was the old whaling city, but it also was a textile giant. As a consequence, most of the buildings were brick, and our remembrances of downtown gave this look to it. If you notice, the streets are gray. In those days, it was all cement streets. We had no blacktop yet. We're now moving towards still New Bedford here. You can see Harrison's Hardware. That was done with permission from Woodland Scenics, who made the building with our name on it. And the S&W headquarters is now located in New York instead of New Bedford as it used to be. And from the remnants of the whaling days, we have the original Seamen's Bethel, which is still in New Bedford, still in use. And it's a place where the seamen, in between trips on their ships or boats, could have a place to stay and worship if they chose to. We're also representing a ship chandler, which is still in New Bedford. The streets are still cobblestone, as they're shown here on the layout. Now, the station on top of the bridge is strictly a display of a current station in Niskayuna, New York, where we live. This is a scale model of it, and this is just our way of showing it off to our customers, how it both looked in the 1940s and 50s and how it looks today. Looks the same. We have in the background here a lift bridge. And the lift bridge is to simulate the one that's on the Cape Cod Canal. If you'll notice, there is a flag up on the top. It's got 48 stars because it's 1958. Now we're coming into Buzzards Bay. Buzzards Bay because that's where I went to school. There's a lot of fun things that happen in Buzzards Bay, but in the winter it was so damn cold that we called it Buzzards Gulch. It used to be just a summer town. Of course, we didn't always like the name of the city because the school we were going to was a little harsh at times. And we have a little tongue-in-cheek with the church scene. Goats usually take care of the grass, but we've got a pig because we like both animals and they're keeping the grass trim for us. We have a celebration of a French bakery, which you can't see. It's Kylie's Boulangerie, and our granddaughter Kylie was hosting a French exchange student, and she also went to France, but that's for her remembrance. As we're going down, the Crystal Burger is an interesting building. When we first moved from Massachusetts to Louisiana, I was still staying in a hotel with a new job, and invited my wife Charlene down, who was quite pregnant at the time, so that we could look at places to live. But in the meantime, we needed a place to go to breakfast. So there was a Crystal Burger that was close to the hotel and did serve a pretty good breakfast, and that's in honor of what we did right after my wife came to Louisiana. Moving further into Buzzards Bay, we revert to a section that replicates the original Buzzards Bay switch tower, which still remains, and this is a scale model of it. in the background, you'll notice a lot of profile buildings. This is an area that celebrates the friendships that we had with various people and businesses while we lived in Louisiana. There's one building that's out of place. On the right side, you'll see it's the Acushnet Company. That is actually in Acushnet, Massachusetts, and was the owner and headquarters of Titleist Golf Equipment. They are still affiliated with Titleist, but don't do as much production in New Bedford as they used to. Moving into the industrial section of Schenectady, we see General Electric, who's well represented. They were the main employers for Schenectady for over 90 years. You had the giants of electricity that founded General Electric, and their headquarters is no longer here, and of course GE has faded somewhat from the scene, but Schenectady still has major production. We're representing the General Electric as we know it today, and some of the other businesses. Proctor's Theater is something that's very prominent in Schenectady, is known through most of the country as one of the old show houses and production places that's still around. Proctor's is going loud and strong in Schenectady now. Schenectady is an old town, and we're representing it again in 1958. And if we can go over to the gas station, and you can't see very well, but the car that's in there, you've got a man that's gassing up the car. You've got another one that's on his knees checking the air on the tires. And you have a man that's washing his windshield. That's service you don't get anymore. But in 1958, it was still happening. We have a representation of a typical city square where we've got a veterans memorial, and there's a nurse that's bringing one of her patients in so that he can reminisce. We've got the typical hot dog vendor sitting outside the park. And as you pan to the right, you can see a basketball game ongoing on the corner. The roundhouse and the turntable you're seeing right now represents the New York Central's facility that they had for Western Albany. Ours isn't quite as big, but it still does the same service. If you pan a little further to the right, you'll see there's a radio tower. That's from WJAR in Providence, which represents where we got our TV signal from all the time we lived in New Bedford. The water scene that shows just to the right as you're panning around is our version of what we see in Ticonderoga, New York, which is a little bit upstate from the Schenectady, Albany area. It's a very good representation, and it's a beautiful area up there. As we come into an oil facility with the housing and sidings here, there is a problem in Albany where the less well-to-do people who are living on the outskirts happen to live very close to an oil processing area where the cars come in, discharge, and haul out. Unfortunately, it's a sign of the times that you have both the economics and the the people are clashing. Back to another view of the roundhouse and yard, and there's always some auxiliary businesses that pop up along the side. You obviously have to have a lot of maintenance. And we celebrate both the New Haven and the Boston and Maine Railroad, who were quite prominent up here, even though it was New York Central land. As you can see, we have a Hudson car dealership. They were still around in the 50s. And as you come in now to the scene, we have the water wheel that's on a grist mill, which was typical for New England. And we have a little bit of the finished product on one side of the building where you can see the bagged product that's being taken out. The next scene we have is pretty representative of a typical area. This includes a lumber company, a beverage supply, a glass company, plumbing, and some self-help production and parcels and stuff available here. The Walton Lumber Company, every piece of wood in there is scale. If you wanted a 2x4 that came in a 21-inch length, you just ask for it here and they'll put it in your truck. The Buzzards Bay Brewery is something new in the area, but I thought that the Buzzards Bay Buzzard should be prominently shown, since that's what we talked about in Buzzards Bay when I went to school, getting plenty of beer. We're looking at some of the cars that service GE. GE, of course, produces, among other things, very large turbines, condensers for the turbines, and needs a way of being able to move this product to the customers. A lot of the product goes down to New Orleans and is shipped out on ships going to the Middle East. And there's an example of this Westinghouse car. It's referred to as a Schnabel. Schnabel is obviously a German name, and the people that produced this design has been around now for over 40 years. The cars can expand for the condenser or the piece that's going in the middle of the car. There are all sorts of extensions that they can do, and they're only limited by the capability of the track and the weight of the product. The track has to have curves large enough to take these very long cars, and has to have the good base because of the tremendous weight that they're carrying. But these are typical to see around the GE factory, and of course we want to make sure that people are aware how proud we are of GE in this area. The Harrison School Transit shows that we were living at the time in Metairie, Louisiana. The gentleman that lit this bus for me is in Canada and was kind enough to relate my name to the capability of moving our kids around to school. So we've left the Metairie here on our New York layout. car that you're looking at is our version of our private car. And this is set up for dining. They'll soon be allowing the passengers to come in. They've already got the candles lit on the table waiting for them.
Dispatcher here. All clear inbound. Over. Copy that. Out.
We're looking at the station that is shared by both Boston and Maine and New Haven on our railroad. New Haven did in fact buy Boston and Maine towards the end of their operations, but we are not time sensitive. In the background we have again impressions of the New Bedford that Shirlene and I grew up with. We were high school schoolmates. And then when we got married, we stayed in the same town and moved into a house that was part of my father's family. The fun thing was that the layout gave us a chance to take things such as the firehouse that you can see, and that has a number 7 on it, which is the firehouse that was around the corner from us when we got married. We also have in that same city block Bill's Cafe, and if you look up at the top it says 1943. That's my date of birth. This is how we have fun putting ourselves into the scenes. When you come to another part of the city, if you look, we can see a sign that says Lund's Corner. That was a location that Cheryl had to stand at, waiting for a bus early in the morning to take her 72 miles to Boston, where she was employed. And then it was another 72 miles by bus back home. But Lund's Corner was a real part of her life for about 4 years. The little park that's in the middle, this really replicates a scene in Fall River, Massachusetts, right near where I was born. There is a bandstand there, and I remember my mother telling me that when Harry Truman was stumping for his presidency, that he came to Fall River and spoke from that building. So we've just made it part of our heritage. The hotel, if you look at the top, has a sign that has a picture of a whale on it. So if you read it properly, it's a whale of a hotel. A little bit tongue-in-cheek. You're looking at 2 versions of the Hellgate Bridge. The Hellgate Bridge is in New Jersey, and there is only one. I've taken poetic license. The real bridge was 4 tracks wide, but ours is only 2. it still gives us a good perspective on one of Lionel's iconic accessories. If you move to the right a little bit, we're coming into a scene that Shirl has made of a typical place to visit in the countryside. And it's got the Volkswagen bus with the streamlined trailer and all period pieces. And that was fun for her doing it because we saw so many pieces like this throughout our lives. Shirl had fun doing a typical scene down in Cape Cod of one of the old type motels. And you can see our families there visiting with their Volkswagen bus and their little streamlined trailer. Also, their friends are having a picnic that they can join. And then there's a boy and a girl talking over the Coke machine about what they're going to do tonight. You'll notice a Boy Scout camp where they are learning how to cook over the fire and have been living in their tent. It's just a good chance to for the Boy Scouts to enjoy the Cape Cod area. Taking a little poetic license, Shirl has made an island, 2 cabins that are typical of those available to people on the Cape. And this shows Grandpa showing his grandson how to fish in their little pond. We've got a couple of the other kids that are playing baseball, and we've got visitors at the next house. And we notice that there's wildlife in the backyard. And on the backside of the island, we've got a couple of young ladies that have stopped their Volkswagen bus and have taken a little swim on that white sandy beach. Now, this road is right next to a little village, and you'll see the red schoolhouse that dates back to the 1930s. The teacher's sitting out there waiting for her pupils. And we've still got a couple of kids that are on the playground. You can next see that there are 2 Cape Cod cottages in this block. And Cape Cod cottages are very famous throughout New England, but particularly on Cape Cod. My parents built a Cape Cod cottage and lived in one for years, so the experiences are very similar to what we're showing. This Cape Cod cottage looks a lot like ours did, and that's my dad just inside the fence cutting the lawn. We did have a beautiful tree out in the front yard, as is depicted here, and again is so typical of the area. You'll notice the fruit truck. There's a produce stand not far from here that you'll see in a moment, and these trucks were back and forth hauling produce from the local farms. A fun piece that we're showing here is from the Cold War period where we still had air raid sirens. That's what they looked like. Rosie's Produce is named after Shirl's mom. Obviously her name was Rose. Her family did in fact have a farm that you'll see in a future segment. But all of the produce that was on the farm was sold at their store. And again, trucks would be delivering product from others that would be sold here, or stuff from the farm. It's very typical of the products that are listed there. The house behind it is from the people that ran the produce stand, and they had chickens. And if you'll notice in the chicken coop that there's a bunch of free range that we have put into the cage. And just to the left is one of the typical outhouses that still exist. There are many trailers in these areas, and we've just picked out a typical one, which is pretty nice. You've got the hostess of the house that's sunning herself with the dog keeping her company, and we've got the barbecue ready for evening time. You'll notice that there is a pump right next to the porch because they still had to hand pump some of their water. These trailers became permanent structures instead of being hauled around. You can find them in most Cape Cod towns. This is the Macabello farm. The Macabellos were Cheryl's grandparents on her mom's side. They came from the Azores, and they settled in Acushnet, Massachusetts, and built themselves a farm. From the day they arrived until the day that her grandfather passed away, he drove a horse-drawn carriage with his produce into town. This gives you a typical look at a farmhouse, and then you'll see in the barn, if you look carefully up in the upper loft, that's Shirlene sitting there. And as you move to the left, you can see that there is a pig pen. And you go a little bit further, you'll see that there's a patch of corn growing, and they've got a deer that's feeding on the produce in there. This is one of my favorite projects. I wanted to have our representation of the Berkshire Hills, which we traverse quite often between Massachusetts and New York. The Berkshire Hills have a section of road that's 1,724 feet above baseline, and this is our impression. In real life, the trains go between Massachusetts and New York in a Hoosick tunnel. We couldn't do that, so we've made our own representation for trains that are coming out of Schenectady to go through this tunnel, which, as you can see, was built in 1899 by the New Haven Railroad. This is our version of the New Bedford waterfront. The deep water area where you see the tugboat, the coal barge, and the cranes working overhead is typical of the deep water area. As we follow further down, the other side of the billboy is a medium depth area where there's a beautiful recreational white beach. The whitewater beach we have kind of separates the harbor area on the left and the deep water area on the right. the seawall is a replica of how we separated the harbor area in New Bedford from the service area where all the work goes on. In the background, we see that there's typical gas stations. The diner has cars from the 1950s because this is 1958. And this happens to be Rosie's Diner. Again, Rosie is actually Rose, Shirlene's mom. Note that on top of the grocery store, they're redoing all of the tar paper work. And you've got other typical businesses. And if you look on the roof, it wasn't unusual for the ladies to put their laundry out to dry. The lift bridge is similar to one on the Cape Cod Canal. And underneath the bridge, you'll see that there's a recreational area, and the kids in that lead canoe are my grandkids. I can tell because they both have red hair. They have to be careful because there's a 20-foot waterfall coming up, and we don't want them to go in there. We're looking at Action Jackson's Auto, new, used, and abused. Jackson is my grandson. Now, if you'll notice, we have Studebakers. That's our dealership. All of these cars to one side are the brand new ones, and the ones to the right are in the used cars. But Studebakers are a favorite of mine just because they were unusual and quite good for the 50s, even though I never had one. We do have one car that's on display on the turntable inside. That gives people a chance from looking outside to see the whole car. You're looking at the SMH Tower. This is an imaginary building in New Bedford. You'll notice at the bottom floor lobby and the next floor mezzanine are very scale detailed. We then go up to the 5th floor where there are 2 of the suites that are occupied, and we can see that they're getting ready for action. You're looking at a statue of Robert E. Lee. When we lived in New Orleans, Robert E. Lee sat on a pedestal for 150 years. Politically, he got caught in the crossfires, and they have removed him to a closed building. He will last forever on my layout. I actually had 2 ships we named for Robert E. Lee, so it's a very close association. For memories, we chose to put the iconic picture of the sailor kissing a woman for the end of World War II. And they are at the foot of Robert E. Lee's statue. And please notice that we are doing road work You can see the fella just coming out of the manhole. This industrial area has a coaling station in the back, but in the forefront, the large stack that's used by two of these different businesses had a problem with some breakage of the stone at the bottom. And please notice, we found a good stonemason to do the repairs. You're looking at the warehouse area where the cargoes both come in and go out. Trains going in both directions.